200 coffins, all for children, kept hidden beneath one house. Why would anyone build such a thing? That's the question at the heart of tonight's tale. But before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I want to see who's brave enough to step into this house with me. The Willow estate crouched at the far end of a gravel road, its gables hunched against the sky like a beast too weary to lift its head. 3 stories of warped wood and shuttered windows stared blankly toward the town that had long since stopped looking back. The roof sagged where storms had pried shingles away. The porch leaned as if bowing under the weight of time. For decades, it had been a house people passed quickly, some with a muttered prayer, others with a curious glance that lingered just long enough to catch the way ivy strangled the siding like veins across pale skin. Everyone in town knew the Willows never threw anything away. Wagons laden with trunks and crates had rumbled up the drive year after year, yet nothing ever left. A broken chair was set beside another broken chair. Newspapers were stacked until they sealed windows like bricks. Even letters, bills, and advertisements were slid beneath rugs when tables grew too cluttered to hold them. The family had become less a presence and more a rumor, reclusive, eccentric, hoarders of things no one wanted. In the spring of 1948, silence fell for good. The last of the Willow line, Agnes, was said to have died upstairs in her sleep. She was buried quietly, with no mourners beyond the minister and 2 gravediggers. The bank, patient for too long, seized the estate in foreclosure. A notice ran in the paper, a handful of lines swallowed in the back pages. Auction of the Willow property. Contents included. Sold as is. When the day arrived, the curious and the greedy filed through the sagging doors. They found a labyrinth of rooms where dust swirled in shafts of light, and every surface sagged beneath decades of clutter. Glass jars of buttons, cracked dolls with staring eyes, heaps of rusted tools, broken bedsteads, crates of ledgers inked in hands no one could read. The air smelled of mildew, mouse droppings, and something older, metallic, sweet, clinging to the tongue. Among those who came was a young couple, Frank and Lillian Hodge. They had saved every dime of his wages from the mill and her sewing work at the boarding house. The house, enormous and crumbling, went for a fraction of its worth. To them it was not ruin but opportunity, walls wide enough to cradle a family, rooms that might one day echo with children's laughter. They signed the papers with shining eyes and stepped across the threshold as owners. The first days were spent shoveling away what had been left behind. Frank carried armfuls of mildewed curtains to the yard and burned them in a barrel. Lillian stacked books whose pages stuck together like wet leaves. Every drawer revealed more: scraps of ribbon, yellowed envelopes, bent forks, cracked spectacles. It seemed endless, but the couple worked with a hopeful vigor. Yet there were things they did not speak of. The jars in the pantry, for example. Shelves upon shelves of preserves long gone to brown sludge. One jar Lillian lifted to the light, then dropped with a sharp gasp. Inside, suspended in thick syrup, floated a tiny shape no fruit ever grew in nature. She said nothing, simply set the jar back on the shelf, hands trembling. On the 3rd day, Frank turned his attention to the basement. The door groaned when he forced it open. A draught rolled upward, damp and metallic, carrying with it the scent of earth turned too long. Lillian refused to follow, clutching her skirts to her knees. So Frank descended alone, flashlight in hand. At first he saw shelves, the usual clutter, jars, crates, a toppled chair. But when his beam swept wider, the shape of the room emerged, rows upon rows, stretching into shadow, boxes of wood, stacked with a soldier's precision. He approached, heart pounding. They were not trunks. They were too small, too narrow. Each bore a brass plate fixed to the lid, tarnished, yet legible. He bent close and read, Elias Willow, 1849. Another, Clara Willow, 1851. Another, Tobias Willow, 1854. The names marched on, one after another, dates spanning decades, then nearly a century. The most recent, Ruth Willow, 1947. Frank's knees weakened. He counted without meaning to. 10, 50, 100, 200. Child-sized coffins, stacked as carefully as books in a library. When he staggered back upstairs, his face grey as ash, Lillian pressed him with frightened whispers until he managed to speak. His voice broke against the words. Coffins. Children's coffins. All of them. That night they did not sleep. The house groaned as if alive, floorboards popping like joints in restless slumber. In the thin light of dawn, Frank locked the front gate with a heavy chain. Whatever secrets the Willows had left behind, they now belonged to him and Lillian. And in the cold hush of that house, the coffins waited, each one holding its silence like a breath that refused to end. The basement door stayed closed for 3 days after Frank's discovery. Neither he nor Lillian spoke of it directly. They moved through the house like actors in a play, speaking of curtains, paint colors, and furniture they did not yet own. But their words were hollow, their eyes always drifting toward the door at the end of the hall, the one that led downward into silence. At night, when the wind pressed against the windows and the rafters groaned, Lillian imagined she could hear faint sounds beneath the floorboards, a shifting like wood settling against wood, or a sigh rising from the earth itself. She clutched the quilt tighter around her shoulders and waited for morning. Frank drank more than usual, lingering with a bottle at the kitchen table until his head sank into his arms. On the 4th morning, he forced himself to return. The air was heavy with mildew and that strange metallic tang. His flashlight beam wavered as he stepped among the rows. The coffins stood just as before, silent, ordered, watching in their way. He ran the light across brass plates until his throat tightened. Not every name bore the Willow surname. There were others. Margaret Hale, 1862. Samuel Price, 1871. Anna Clark, 1885. Families no one in town had spoken of in decades, names swallowed by time. He brushed dust from a lid and stared. Each coffin was no larger than a child's toy chest. He forced the thought down, but it grew in him like rot. 200 children, all preserved beneath one family's house. When he climbed back upstairs, Lillian was waiting. She asked no questions, only pressed a cup of coffee into his hand. Her silence was heavier than words. That afternoon, a knock came at the front door. An old man stood on the porch, hat in hand, leaning on a cane. His spine bent in a way that suggested years of hard work. His eyes, though clouded with age, fixed on Frank with startling sharpness. "You're the new owners," he said. His voice rasped like dry leaves. Frank nodded. "Yes, we We're cleaning it up." The old man's gaze drifted past him, into the dim hall. "Careful what you stir." "Excuse me." The man shifted, cane tapping against the porch boards. "That house don't like to be woken. Best you sell it and move on." Frank forced a laugh, though it came brittle. "We've put our money here. We're not moving." The old man gave him a long look, then nodded once, slow. "So be it. My name's Henry Clark. My family used to live down by the mill. You might have seen a name or two in that cellar." The mention of the cellar froze Frank's tongue. He hadn't spoken of it. Not to anyone. Henry's eyes narrowed, as though reading his silence. Best not to open what's meant to stay shut. He tipped his hat and turned down the path, limping away with steps that carried finality. When Frank closed the door, Lillian was standing in the shadows of the hallway. Her voice trembled. How did he know? Neither of them slept that night. On the fifth day, Lillian could no longer bear it. She descended the basement stairs with a lantern clutched in both hands. Her skirts brushed the stone steps, and her breath echoed against the low ceiling. The coffins gleamed faintly, rows upon rows. She approached the nearest, brushing her fingers across the plate. Ruth Willow, 1947. Her hand lingered. She whispered the name, testing the sound in the cold air. Somewhere behind her, in the darkness between stacks, wood creaked as though shifting under invisible weight. She spun, lantern shaking. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. But when she turned back, her gaze caught on something she had not seen before. A small bundle of cloth tucked behind one of the coffins, half hidden in shadow. She bent down, lantern low. It was a doll. Porcelain face, cracked down the cheek. One glass eye missing. Its dress was stiff with age, its tiny hands outstretched as though waiting to be taken. Lillian recoiled, nearly dropping the lantern. Her foot struck the edge of another coffin, sending a shudder through the row. A sound answered in the silence, a hollow echo like wood knocking from within. Her scream carried all the way up the stairs. When Frank found her, she was standing at the top step, lantern still in hand, eyes wide and wild. She would not go back down. She would not speak of what she had heard. Only when dawn broke did she whisper, "There's more to this than coffins." And the house, old and listening, seemed to settle deeper into itself, as though pleased to be remembered. Morning light did little to soften the unease that clung to the Willow estate. The Hodges ate their breakfast in silence, every scrape of a fork sounding too sharp against the plates. Lillian's hands trembled as she buttered bread she never touched. Frank kept glancing toward the hall where the basement door waited, as though it might open of its own accord. By noon, the stillness of the house pressed in so heavily that Frank shoved his chair back and announced he would go into town. Lillian begged him not to leave her alone, but he insisted. Supplies were needed if they were to keep cleaning, and he longed for the company of ordinary voices, the comfort of streets where shadows did not whisper. The town greeted him with cautious curiosity. At the hardware store, men leaned on the counter and asked about the house. Frank gave little away, just that it was a mess, just that the family had left more behind than anyone could use. The storekeeper, a man named Oliver Finch, chuckled grimly. "That house always did eat what went into it," Finch said. "Your best bet is to tear it down to the bones." Frank forced a smile. "We'll manage." On his way out, An elderly woman with a shawl tight around her shoulders stopped him. Her eyes were pale and unblinking. "You found them, haven't you?" Frank froze. "Found what?" "The little coffins," she said, voice thin as thread. "They've been there longer than I've been alive. Best you don't disturb them." She shuffled away before he could ask more. When Frank returned to the estate, he found Lillian sitting on the porch steps, pale as chalk. She rose quickly, clutching his arm. "Don't leave me alone here again. Not ever." "What happened?" he asked. Her eyes flicked to the windows. "Footsteps. Upstairs. I heard them walking, back and forth, back and forth. But when I went to look, nothing. No one." He wanted to dismiss it, wanted to say the house simply creaked with age. But her fear was too sharp, too raw. He swallowed his words. That night, they barred the doors and windows, though they knew locks meant little against whatever lingered in the willow walls. Sleep came fitfully. Frank dreamed of brass plates shining in the dark, names whispered one after another in children's voices. Lillian woke gasping, convinced she felt small hands pressing against her throat. The following morning, Frank made a decision. "We need to know," he said, staring into his coffee. "If we're to live here, we need to understand what we've inherited." Lillian shook her head violently. "Leave it buried. Please, Frank. Don't touch them." But he could not turn from it. That evening he descended again into the basement, this time carrying a crowbar. His heart thundered as he approached the nearest coffin. The brass plate read Elias Willow, 1849. He hesitated only a moment before sliding the iron beneath the lid and prying. The wood groaned. Dust swirled into the beam of his lantern. The lid cracked open. Inside lay not bone, not the remains he had braced for, but something else entirely. Bundles of cloth, carefully folded, layered one upon another. Baby clothes. Tiny shoes, brittle with age. Locks of hair tied with ribbons. At the very bottom, a photograph. Sepia, faces blurred but unmistakably children. Frank's chest tightened. He shifted to another coffin, pried it open. The same. Relics, belongings, pieces of a child's life preserved as though death had not taken them, as though memory alone could hold them whole. Relief rushed through him, followed quickly by unease. 200 coffins filled not with bodies, but with fragments, keepsakes, offerings. Why bury them in boxes shaped like graves? Why mark each with a name and date? As he set the lid back in place, something stirred behind him. A soft shuffle, like bare feet across stone. He spun, lantern high. The rows stretched silent. Dust floated. And then, faintly, he heard it. A child's laugh, so soft it might have been memory. He bolted upstairs, slamming the door behind him. His breath came ragged as he told Lillian what he had found. She listened, lips pressed thin. "Clothes," she whispered. "Shoes. Hair. Not bodies." Frank nodded. "But names. Dates. As though—" He stopped himself. "As though what?" "As though the Willows kept every child they ever lost," he finished. "As though they built a graveyard out of memory." The house groaned around them, and both turned toward the ceiling. In the silence that followed, the sound came again, light, deliberate, the unmistakable patter of small feet running across the floor above. The sound of footsteps lingered in their ears long after it ceased. Frank and Lillian stood frozen in the parlor, eyes tilted upward to the ceiling where dust drifted from the joists. Neither spoke until the silence stretched so thin it seemed ready to split. At last Lillian whispered, "They're playing." Her words unsettled Frank more than the noise itself. He wanted to protest, to remind her the house was empty, but something in her tone, soft, certain, kept him silent. That night, they lit every lamp in the house and sat together in the parlor, listening. Hours crept by. The lamps sputtered. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. Then, just past midnight, the sound returned, quick pattering feet, skipping and circling above. Lillian pressed her hands over her ears, rocking slightly, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. Frank rose, jaw tight. Enough. He grabbed the lantern and climbed the stairs, each step groaning beneath his weight. The hallway stretched ahead, shadows crowding between door frames. He flung doors open one by one, empty bedrooms thick with dust, closets crammed with yellowing dresses and moth-eaten coats, a nursery with a cradle swaying gently as though touched by an unseen hand. The footsteps ceased the moment he entered the hall. Silence pressed close, suffocating. Frank's lantern flickered. He felt eyes upon him, small and many, watching from corners he could not see. Then, laughter, faint, drifting from the nursery. A child's giggle, light as wind chimes. The cradle stilled. Frank backed away, heart hammering, and fled down the stairs. He did not speak of what he'd heard, but Lillian saw it in his face and knew. Over the next days, the house grew restless. Doors that had been shut swung open with sharp creaks. Objects shifted from one room to another. Once, Lillian found her sewing kit laid out neatly on the dining table, needles stuck upright in spools of thread as if waiting for tiny hands to resume a task. Another time, Frank discovered the pantry door ajar, jars arranged in a new order, by height, by color, as though someone had been playing a game. At night, whispers drifted through the walls. Not words exactly, but the cadence of speech, children murmuring to one another just beyond hearing. One evening, desperate for answers, Frank returned to town and sought out Henry Clark, the old man who had warned him. He found him at the diner, hunched over a cup of coffee, eyes on the window, though the glass reflected only his own face. "I opened one," Frank admitted quietly, sliding into the booth across from him. There were no bodies, just clothes, keepsakes, hair. Henry's gaze shifted at last, slow and weary. "That's worse." "Why?" "Because it means they didn't bury what they lost. They kept it, held on, like they could stitch memory into something whole. That kind of grief festers. It doesn't rest." Frank swallowed hard. "You're saying—" "I'm saying the Willows didn't let go. And when the living won't let go, the dead can't either." The words echoed in Frank's skull all the way back to the estate. He found Lillian in the parlor, staring at the cold fireplace. She looked up at him with eyes rimmed red. "I heard them singing," she whispered. "Children's voices. A lullaby. They sang until I thought I'd go mad." That night, the singing came again. Faint at first, then rising, threads of melody weaving through the halls. It was not joyful but mournful, a song of endings sung by voices too young to understand. Frank and Lillian clung to each other in the dark, waiting for it to fade. When dawn finally broke, they resolved to leave. The estate was too much, its secrets too heavy. But as they packed what little they had brought, they discovered every trunk they tried to fill stood empty again by morning. Clothes they had folded were returned to drawers. Suitcases unlatched themselves. It was as though the house refused to let them go. And in the basement, the coffins waited. 200 names, 200 memories, each one holding tight to a past that would not release its grip. By the first week of October, the air around the Willow estate had thickened with dread. The leaves on the surrounding trees turned brittle and fell in heaps, yet the house seemed untouched by the season, as though time itself moved differently inside its walls. Frank and Lillian no longer spoke of escape. Their earlier attempts had been thwarted too cleanly to be dismissed as chance. Suitcases returned themselves, doors jammed shut, and one afternoon when Frank tried to drive their truck down the gravel road, the engine died just beyond the gate. When he looked back, the house stood framed in the rearview mirror, patient and waiting. It seemed the estate had claimed them. The nights became the worst. The children's games grew bolder. Laughter skittered through the halls. Shadows darted past doorways. Once, Lillian woke to the sound of something small dragging across the floorboards beside her bed. She dared not move until morning, when she found a line of marbles laid neatly along the rug, circling the bed like a boundary. Frank, restless and hollow-eyed, returned again and again to the basement. Each time he opened another coffin, hoping for some explanation. He found more keepsakes, tiny shoes, hand-stitched dolls, drawings in crayon faded to near invisibility, and always, at the bottom, locks of hair tied with ribbon. He began to keep a notebook, listing names and dates, piecing together a ledger of the forgotten. Some belonged to the Willows, yes, but others, Clark, Hale, Price, Murphy, spoke of families scattered across the county. He carried the book upstairs one evening and laid it before Lillian. 200 children, he said, all gone before they were grown. Why? Why here? Lillian's eyes traced the names. She touched one with trembling fingers. Anna Clark, 1885. That old man, she murmured. Henry. He must know. The next day, Frank sought Henry again. The old man sat on his porch, cane resting across his knees, eyes hollow as if he had been waiting. "You're not the first to ask," Henry said when Frank showed him the ledger. "My grandmother told me stories. Children sick with fever, some withered before they could walk, some lost to accidents. But when they died, the Willows came knocking. They offered to take the bodies, to tend them proper. Families too poor or broken agreed, and when the Willows stopped asking, they simply took what was left behind: clothes, toys, anything that proved the child had lived." Frank's stomach turned. Why coffins? Henry's gaze fell to the gravel. Because they believed memory was stronger than earth, that if you kept the vessel, the belongings, the spirit could linger. Not in heaven, not gone. Here. Forever. Frank felt cold seep into his bones. And it worked. Henry's silence was answer enough. That evening, as the Hodges sat in the parlour with the ledger between them, the air shifted. The lamps dimmed. A giggle rippled through the room. Close, too close. Lillian's teacup tipped. spilling across the table, though no hand touched it. Then came a whisper, unmistakable and near. "Stay!" Lillian screamed, clutching Frank's arm. He leapt to his feet, eyes wild, but the room was empty. Only the shadows stirred. That night, neither dared close their eyes. They sat awake while the house hummed with unseen life, pattering feet, creaking boards, the faint, sorrowful hum of a lullaby echoing through the walls. And in the stillness between sounds, the word repeated, soft and insistent, breathed by 100 tiny voices. "Stay!" The word clung to them. Stay. It followed Frank and Lillian through the halls, seeped into their dreams, whispered through the cracks of the house like wind under a door. At first, it came faintly, a suggestion. Then it grew into a command. Lillian changed first. She stopped going outside, stopped opening curtains. She wandered from room to room as though searching for something, her fingertips brushing over dust-caked toys, faded quilts, chipped porcelain dolls. Sometimes Frank found her murmuring names from the ledger, rocking gently as if soothing a child. "They're lonely," she said when he begged her to stop. "They want us to remember them. That's all." Frank tried to hold on to reason. He still went into town, though less often, and people began to notice the hollowness in his eyes. At the general store, Oliver Finch muttered that the Willow house was doing its work again. At the diner, the old woman in the shawl asked softly, "Has she started speaking to them yet?" Frank fled without answering. Back at the estate, he found Lillian sitting cross-legged on the nursery floor, arranging the marbles into neat rows. The cradle rocked beside her, though no hand touched it. She looked up and smiled faintly. "They like it when I play." That night, Frank awoke to the sound of voices. Not the faint whispers he had grown accustomed to, but full words, clear as if spoken in the room. Children's voices, dozens of them, chanting names one after another, the very names etched on brass plates in the basement. Lillian sat upright in bed, repeating the chant with them, her eyes glazed. Frank shook her until she gasped back into herself, but even then she whispered, "They don't mean harm. They just want to be remembered." The following day, desperate, Frank returned to the basement. Lantern in hand, he wandered the rows of coffins. He shouted at the silence, "What do you want from us? We're not your family." His voice cracked against the stone. "You can't keep us here." The air seemed to shiver. Dust drifted down from the beams, and from the far end of the room, a coffin lid shifted with a soft creak. Then another. Then another. One by one, lids slid open, just a fraction, revealing folded cloth, tiny shoes, dolls, hair bound with ribbon. The sound grew, hundreds of coffins creaking, exhaling dust. The lantern sputtered, threatening to go dark. Frank stumbled backward, tripping on the steps as he fled. When he slammed the door shut, his hands shook so badly he could barely turn the lock. That night, the house did not merely whisper, it throbbed with presence. The parlor filled with laughter and song. Upstairs, doors slammed open and shut in rhythm, as if to the beat of unseen games. And in the nursery, the cradle rocked violently, its wooden legs thumping against the floorboards until splinters broke free. Lillian rose from her chair and walked calmly into the hall. "They need me," she said, voice dreamlike. Frank caught her arm, but she slipped free with surprising strength. He followed her to the nursery, where she knelt by the cradle, humming softly. Around her, the marbles rolled of their own accord, circling her like planets. Dolls shifted on shelves, their glass eyes catching the dim light. Frank shouted her name, but she did not answer. Instead, she began to rock with the cradle, her voice blending with the unseen choir of children. In that moment, Frank understood. The Willows had not built a memorial. They had built a trap. Each coffin was a doorway, each keepsake a tether. The children's spirits had been bound, held fast by grief and possession, and now they demanded more. And the house, patient as ever, had found its next family. The days blurred after that. Sunlight still reached the windows, but inside the Willow estate, time felt muted, slowed to the rhythm of children's games. Frank would wake in the morning to the sound of skipping ropes slapping the upstairs floors, the echo of laughter chasing through the halls. Lillian was often gone from the bed, drawn into the nursery before dawn, where she sat rocking the cradle and whispering lullabies to the empty air. Frank tried to pull her away. He pleaded, argued, even shouted, but her eyes, once sharp with fear, had softened into something else entirely. A mother's gaze, fixed on children he could not see. "They need me," she said again and again. "They've been waiting so long." Frank fought against it with everything he had. He hammered the basement door shut with nails, tried to starve the house of its power, but the air only thickened until every breath tasted of dust and iron. He boarded up the nursery window, yet the cradle rocked harder, furious in its rhythm, until the boards cracked and splintered. One night, he dreamed of the coffins. He walked among them, lantern in hand, though the light cast no shadows. Each lid stood open, and inside lay not keepsakes but children themselves, 200 of them, pale and still, yet with eyes wide open. They watched him without blinking, and as he passed, each whispered the same word, "Stay." When he woke, Lillian was gone. Panic drove him through the halls until he found her downstairs, sitting cross-legged in the basement doorway. The nails he had driven in were gone, pulled free as though by invisible hands. She turned to him with a strange serenity. "They're ready," she said. He dragged her back upstairs, but she did not fight. She only smiled faintly, like a mother humoring a stubborn child. That night she whispered in her sleep, "If you love me, Frank, you'll let me go to them." The next day, Henry Clark returned. Frank found him at the gate, leaning heavily on his cane, eyes fixed on the looming house. "You look like a man drowning," Henry said. Frank poured out everything, the laughter, the singing, the coffins opening, Lillian slipping further away. Henry listened in silence, then nodded grimly. "They've chosen her," he said at last. "The Willows always needed someone to tend the collection. Agnes was the last. Now it's her turn." "No," Frank spat. "I won't let that happen." Henry's gaze sharpened. "You think you have a choice? That house has roots deeper than you can imagine. It doesn't let go. Never did. Then tell me how to fight it." Henry hesitated, eyes clouded. "The coffins are the anchor. Every ribbon, every shoe, every scrap of cloth, that's where they linger. You'd have to burn them. All of them." Frank's breath caught. 200 coffins, and 200 souls bound to them, Henry said quietly. "They'll fight you. They'll make you pay. But it's the only way. That night, Frank told Lillian his plan. She stared at him as though he had spoken blasphemy. "You can't," she whispered. "They'll be lost forever." "They're already lost," he said. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "No, Frank. They're waiting for someone to love them. That's why they're here. That's why they chose me." Her words carved into him, but he steeled himself. As Lillian slept, he crept to the basement with a can of kerosene and a box of matches. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, surrounded by 200 coffins, the smell of oil sharp in his nostrils. His hands shook as he splashed the liquid across the lids, soaking cloth and ribbon. The air shifted. Whispers rose, not faint now but furious, swelling into a cacophony of children's voices. The coffins shuddered. Lids rattled. Dolls clattered to the floor. The lantern swung violently, though no hand touched it. "Stay!" the voices shrieked, not pleading now but commanding. Frank struck a match, and from the top of the stairs, Lillian screamed his name. The match trembled in Frank's fingers, its flame guttering in the heavy air. Below him, the basement roared with voices, hundreds of children crying out at once, their tones weaving between rage and desperation. The coffins rattled like teeth in a skull. Dust fell from the beams as though the house itself shuddered. "Frank, no!" Lillian's scream tore down the stairwell. She stood above him, pale in her nightdress, hair loose and wild, eyes wide with terror and fury. "You'll kill them. Don't you understand? They're not evil. They're scared." Frank's jaw clenched, sweat pouring down his brow. "They've trapped you, Lillian. They've trapped us both. If we don't end this, we'll never leave." She descended the steps slowly, each board creaking beneath her bare feet. The lantern light painted her face with shifting shadows. "They chose me. They need someone to care for them. Agnes is gone, but I can be the one. Don't you see? This is why we came here." "No," Frank said, his voice breaking. "We came here for a life of our own. For our children, not theirs." At that, the voices rose into a shriek so piercing Frank nearly dropped the match. The coffins banged violently against one another. From the corners of the basement, toys began to roll toward him, marbles clattering like hail, dolls tumbling across the stone floor with stiff arms outstretched. "Stay!" the chorus thundered. Frank struck the match against the stair rail, the tiny flame flaring bright. He lifted it toward the kerosene-soaked coffins. Lillian screamed again and hurled herself at him. The impact knocked the match from his hand. It fell to the floor, sputtered, and went out. The children's laughter burst forth, high-pitched and mocking. The dolls stopped their movement and lay still, as if satisfied. Frank and Lillian grappled on the stairs, her fingers clawing at his wrists. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "They'll take me whether you burn them or not. At least if I stay, I can make them gentle. I can keep them from hurting you." Her words chilled him. He pulled free, panting, and backed up a step. "You're not theirs, Lillian. You're mine. You're alive. And I won't let this house have you." She stared at him, trembling, torn between devotion and some deeper compulsion. Then, slowly, her gaze softened. "If you burn them, Frank, what if they're all that's left of those children? What if we destroy the only proof they ever lived? He faltered. Her words sank into him, heavy and sharp. He saw again the tiny shoes, the brittle dresses, the locks of hair tied with ribbons, tokens of lives too brief to be remembered any other way. If he set them aflame, would he not be erasing them a second time? But the laughter swelled again, crueler now, as though mocking his hesitation. The coffins banged harder, lids slamming open and shut. Something unseen brushed past his legs, cold as river water. "They don't love us," Frank whispered. "They're using us." Lillian's lips trembled. For the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. The lantern sputtered. Shadows thickened. A child's voice, clear as day, spoke from the nearest coffin. "Mama!" Lillian's face crumpled. She sank to her knees, covering her mouth as tears spilled freely. "Do you hear them, Frank? They're calling for me." The air grew heavy, pressing down on them. Frank realized with a jolt that the house itself seemed to lean closer, listening, waiting. Every breath, every heartbeat belonged to its walls. He reached for Lillian, his voice low and urgent. "If we don't end this now, we'll never leave. We'll be just like the Willows, keepers of coffins, prisoners in our own home. Is that what you want for us?" Her sobs filled the basement. The children's voices rose higher, shrill and insistent, crying her name, begging her to stay. The marbles began to spin in circles around her knees, and Frank, trembling, reached into his pocket for another match. The match flared and caught. For a sliver of a second, the basement was a furnace of light. The brass plates glinted, the ribbons shimmered, the faces in the photographs seemed to lift toward the flame. The kerosene hissed as it met fire. Heat licked Frank's knuckles and smelled of old cloth and iron. Around him, the house responded with a keening that was neither child nor animal, but something older, a sound threaded through with grief and hunger. Lillian cried out, hands thrust toward the nearest coffin as if to shield whatever lay beneath its lid. The marbles skittered like frantic beetles, and dolls tumbled, glass eyes catching the blaze. For a heartbeat, the voices rose into a single, piercing wail that made every hair on Frank's arms stand on end. Then the flames took hold and a ribbon caught, curling into ash. A lock of hair shriveled and turned black. Frank moved from box to box, striking match after match, hands shaking but steady. The light showed him the faces on the plates as he worked, names he had memorized from his ledger, dates that turned sunlight into a long, slow trail of loss. Some coffins yielded ribbons and shoes that flamed away in an instant. Others held fabric stiff with age that smoldered and filled the room with a choking, sweet smoke. The smell of burning memory thickened until it seemed to clog his throat. Below, the house pushed back. Lids slammed, not in unison but in waves, organs of a giant catching breath. Toys rolled faster, forming frantic rivers at Frank's feet. The cradle above thumped in reply, a steady percussion that sounded like a heart trying to break free. Lillian, weeping, began to chant names, not to call them but as if to soothe them, to let each ember know it was not alone as it vanished. Her voice twisted between prayer and lullaby. At one point, a small hand, no bigger than his thumb, pale as cured bone, slid from beneath a lid and reached for Frank. Instinct made him snatch it, and for a second he held a child's hand in his palm. It was cold and impossibly light. The moment his fingers closed, The hand became ash and drifted down through his knuckles. He swallowed bile and kept moving. There was no time for tenderness. The cacophony rose to a fevered pitch. The very walls seemed to sweat with the heat of it. Dust fell in curtains. A photograph on the floor curled and browned at the edges, and as it blackened Frank thought he saw, for a blink, a child's mouth forming the syllable stay. Then the image was smoke. He kept striking matches until his fingers hurt, until the box of matches sat empty and the kerosene can hissed low and sullen. When at last the flames began to die, the basement lay altered. Soot carpeted the stone. The air was thick and raw. Many coffins were charred hulks, their brass plates warped and blackened. Others, perhaps shielded by folds or tucked beneath heavier keepsakes, survived with edges singed but intact. The choir of voices thinned from a roar to a mutter, like a storm moving out over a distant sea. Lillian slumped against a stack of blackened wood, exhausted, her face streaked with ash and tears. Frank crouched beside her, hands numb, ledger abandoned on the floor. They did not celebrate. The house had not surrendered. It had been wounded, and wounds often festered. From upstairs came an odd stillness, one that pressed on their ears. Without the steady noise of toys and voices, every creak and settling sound became a threat. The nursery door creaked open slowly, and the cradle lay toppled, its rockers splintered. On the floor beside it, a single marble rolled to a stop against the baseboard and lay there, glossy and untouched by flame. Outside, twilight had deepened into night. The Hodges climbed the stairs in silence, dragging the remains of burned wood behind them. Lillian paused at the top, looking back over the house as if trying to read some change in its posture. For the first time since they had crossed the threshold, there was a thread of something like relief in her expression, faint and fragile as a moth's wing. Frank closed the basement door behind them and bolted it, and they stood for a long time leaning against it, listening to the house breathe. They had taken away much, but not everything. Some boxes remained whole. Some plates were only blackened at their corners. Somewhere within the walls, something had survived. Frank and Lillian understood then that their act had not been an ending but an opening, an escalation. The Willows' legacy was bruised but not broken, and it now had reason to be furious. They had chosen a fight with the thing that held 200 names and had only just scratched its skin. They slept little that night. What sleep came was shallow and filled with images of children reaching through smoke and the steady, mournful cadence of a lullaby. Only now, beneath the notes, there was a new sound, the slow, deliberate creaking of the house preparing to respond. Morning came grey and brittle, the kind of dawn where the sky seemed drained of colour. Frank woke to the smell of soot still clinging to his skin, his clothes, the bedding itself. Beside him, Lillian lay restless, murmuring in her sleep, her fingers twitching as if counting something unseen. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No laughter, no patter of feet, no rocking cradle. For the first time since their arrival, the silence seemed unnatural, like the pause before a word that should never be spoken. Frank dressed quickly and crept down the hall. The nursery door was ajar, though he remembered closing it the night before. Inside, the cradle lay toppled where it had fallen, but the toys were neatly arranged again, marbles stacked in a perfect pyramid, dolls seated upright in a row, ribbons coiled into circles. The air was cold enough that his breath fogged. On the wall above the cradle, a new word had appeared, traced in soot as though by a child's finger. Mama. Frank staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He turned to flee and nearly collided with Lillian. She stood in the doorway, her nightdress pale as bone, her hair tangled, her eyes wide and strange. "They're still here," she whispered. "You hurt them, Frank, but you didn't set them free. You made them angry." Her words were barely finished when a thud echoed from below, deep, resonant, like a coffin lid slamming shut. Then another, and another. Soon the entire floor trembled as the basement erupted in a rhythm of pounding wood, each strike harder than the last. The house joined in. Doors upstairs slammed in sequence, shutters rattled, windows groaned in their frames. It was as though the children had found a new game, a house-sized drum, beating to their fury. Frank grabbed Lillian's shoulders. "We can still leave. Right now. Before it's too late." She shook her head slowly. "It's already too late. They won't let us go." A crash cut her words short. The parlor mirror shattered from the inside out, glass spraying into the hallway. Shards glittered like ice in the dim light. In the dining room, chairs scraped violently across the floor, arranging themselves in a circle around the table. The chandelier above them swayed, metal groaning as if under a great weight. Frank dragged Lillian toward the front door, his heart hammering. He wrenched at the knob, but it would not turn. The wood beneath his hands felt warm, as though the house itself pulsed with blood. He threw his shoulder against it, again and again, but it held fast. Behind them, the voices rose once more, not whispers this time, but laughter. Not playful, but sharp, cruel, echoing from every room. The dolls in the nursery clattered down the stairs one by one, limbs stiff but determined, their glass eyes fixed forward. Frank grabbed the poker from the hearth and swung, shattering 2 dolls into splinters, but more followed, dozens of them, tumbling like soldiers into formation. Lillian dropped to her knees, clutching her head. "Stop! Please stop!" she cried. The laughter ceased at once. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed in on them, heavy and suffocating. Then, in the dark hush, a child's voice spoke, clear, high, and right beside Lillian's ear. "We don't need him." She gasped, her head snapping toward the sound, but nothing stood there. Only air cold enough to sting her skin. Another voice followed, from the other side. "Just you." Frank's grip on the poker tightened, knuckles white. "Don't listen to them," he hissed. "They're lying." But Lillian's eyes were fixed on something Frank could not see. Her lips trembled as if she were about to answer. The dolls stopped their advance and stood waiting, heads tilted, as though listening for her reply. The house held its breath. Lillian froze, the dolls staring as if waiting for her decision. Frank shook her shoulders, desperate. "Don't answer them." Her lips parted, but instead of words, she let out a sob. The house groaned, floorboards warping beneath their feet. From the basement came a low rumble, like something waking. Frank dragged her back, clutching the poker, but the voices hissed in unison. "She stays." The front door split down the middle, not opening but cracking like bone. A draught rushed in, icy, smelling of ash and earth. Frank realized with sudden clarity, the house wasn't keeping them in. It was trying to separate them. The crack in the front door spread, with splintering like ribs. Cold air hissed through, carrying the faint sound of children giggling just outside. Frank swung the poker at the crack, splinters flying, But each strike only sealed the gap tighter, the wood knitting itself back together as though the house were healing. Behind him, the dolls stood motionless, watching Lillian. Her breath came fast, her hands trembling in her lap. "They won't stop," she whispered. "Not until Until you what?" Frank snapped. Her eyes flicked up to his, brimming with tears. "Until I stay." "No," he growled. "Not like this. Not for them." The house answered with a deep shudder, plaster cracking overhead. From the basement rose the sound of lids slamming again, then silence. Heavy, waiting silence. Frank gripped her wrist. "We finish what we started. Burn it all. Every last piece. That's the only way." She hesitated, torn between terror and longing, her gaze sliding toward the nursery where the word Mama still smeared the wall. The silence deepened, as if the whole house bent closer to hear her answer. Finally, she nodded. A small, fragile nod, but it was enough. Frank pulled her toward the basement door. The bolt resisted, trembling under unseen pressure, but with a grunt he forced it free. The door swung open, breathing out a cold draught thick with soot. The two of them stood at the threshold, staring down into the dark where the last of the coffins waited. The matchbox felt heavy in Frank's pocket, and from below a single child's voice rose up, soft and broken. "Please don't leave us in the dark." Frank struck the match. The tiny flame trembled in the dark, reflected 100 times in brass plates and glass eyes. Lillian clutched his arm, but she didn't stop him. Together, they stepped into the basement. One by one, they lit the coffins. Flames leapt, devouring ribbons, shoes, and brittle fabric. The children's voices rose, first pleading, then furious, then fading into a chorus of cries that blurred into the roar of the fire. The air grew suffocating, walls shaking as if the whole house resisted. Lillian collapsed to her knees, sobbing, but Frank pulled her up. "Don't look back." They stumbled up the stairs as the fire spread, smoke curling through the halls. The dolls melted, their faces sagging, their glass eyes bursting in the heat. Above, the word Mama on the wall blackened and vanished. When they reached the front door, it opened easily, as if it had never been locked. They staggered into the night air, coughing, the house blazing behind them. 4 hours they sat in the field, watching the Willow estate burn. The laughter never returned. No voices whispered from the smoke, only the crackle of fire and the slow collapse of the roof into glowing embers. By dawn, nothing remained but a blackened skeleton of walls and the smell of ash. Lillian leaned against Frank, her face pale and hollow. "Do you think they're gone?" she asked. Frank stared at the ruin. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe it. But in the silence between the crow's cries and the wind through the charred beams, he thought he heard it, faint, almost lost in the morning air. A marble rolling to a stop. The Willows' house is gone, but their whispers linger. Don't miss what comes next. Hit subscribe and join me here on Eternal Obsidian.